I never thought I would see him again after all these years. When the message appeared on my phone that evening, I stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure if it was real. The text was short and strangely calm. "We need to talk, tonight." No explanation, no apology, just 4 simple words that made my heart beat faster than it had in years. My name is Elara Miles, and I built my life very carefully after everything that happened in the past. I chose routines that were quiet and predictable, because predictable things rarely hurt you. For a long time, that strategy worked, and my world stayed small, controlled, and safe. But tonight, that fragile balance felt like it was about to break. I was sitting in a small restaurant on the corner of Oak Street, the kind of place people choose for quiet dinners and long conversations. Warm yellow lights hung from the ceiling, and the smell of roasted coffee mixed with grilled onions filled the room. Around me, people were laughing and talking, living their completely ordinary evenings, while I pretended to scroll through my phone and waited for the one person I never expected to see again. Then the door opened, and he walked in. Tristan Hale. For 5 years, I convinced myself that part of my life was finished. I imagined many different endings for our story, quiet endings, painful endings, even endings where we never crossed paths again. But seeing him walk through that door tonight was never one of them. He looked older now, sharper somehow, like time had carved new confidence into his face. Yet the same familiar smirk rested on his lips, the one that always made it seem like he knew something everyone else didn't. The moment he stepped into the room, my chest tightened in a way I hated to admit. Once upon a time, Tristan had been the person I trusted more than anyone else. We met in college, at a time when everything in life felt temporary and exciting. We were ambitious, impatient, and completely certain the future belonged to us. Long nights studying together slowly turned into conversations about dreams, fears, and plans that seemed enormous at the time. I told him things I had never told anyone else. The quiet insecurities, the mistakes, the parts of myself people usually hide. And then he betrayed me, not with a small mistake that could be forgiven and forgotten, but in a way that shattered the trust I had placed in him completely. After that moment, everything changed. Trust became harder, people became harder, and for a long time I believed I would never fully recover from it. Across the table, my best friend Maya followed my gaze toward the entrance, and immediately understood what was happening. She leaned closer and spoke quietly, careful that no one else could hear. "That's him, isn't it?" I nodded once, my eyes still fixed on Tristan as he moved through the restaurant. "Just stay calm," Maya whispered. "Don't let him see that this still affects you." I tried to follow her advice, but watching him walk toward me felt like watching the past slowly come back to life. He moved with slow, confident steps, the kind of steps that suggested he had already imagined this meeting many times. When he reached the table, he paused for a second, studying my face carefully, as if searching for the person I used to be. "Elara," he said. His voice was softer than I remembered, almost gentle, but there was something hidden beneath it, something that made my instincts tighten immediately. "Tristan," I replied. The word felt strange leaving my mouth after so many years. He sat down across from me, and for a few minutes we spoke about harmless things. Work, the city, small updates about life, the kind of conversations strangers might have, while pretending nothing important had ever happened between them. Anyone sitting nearby would have assumed we were simply old acquaintances catching up after a long time apart. But the way Tristan looked at me told a different story. His eyes kept searching my expression, patient and careful, like he was waiting for a crack in the calm mask I had built. Slowly, a realization formed in my mind. He had not come here to apologize. Halfway through the meal, Tristan leaned back slightly and mentioned something that made my thoughts freeze instantly. It was a detail from my past, a mistake I had made years ago, something I had buried and never spoken about again. My fingers tightened around the glass in front of me, and I forced a small laugh to keep my voice steady. "How do you even know that?" I asked. Tristan watched me for a moment, and then a faint, almost amused smile appeared on his face. "Some things are difficult to forget," he said slowly. And some debts take longer to settle than people expect. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. Conversations blurred into the background, while his words echoed quietly in my mind. That was when the truth finally hit me. This meeting had never been about closure. It had never been about reconciliation, and suddenly I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. I might have known Tristan once, but the man sitting across from me tonight was a stranger. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The quiet between us felt heavier than any argument could have been, like the air itself was waiting to see who would break first. I kept my expression calm, but inside my thoughts were racing, because the way Tristan said those words did not sound like a casual memory. It sounded like a warning. I slowly placed the glass back on the table and leaned slightly forward. "You didn't come here just to talk about the past," I said carefully. "So stop pretending. What do you actually want?" Tristan studied my face for a moment, almost impressed by the directness. Then he gave a small nod, like he had expected this reaction sooner or later. "You were always quick to see through things," he said quietly. "That's one of the reasons I liked you." The comment made my jaw tighten, but I didn't respond. He rested his arms on the table and lowered his voice a little, making sure our conversation stayed private. 5 years ago, when everything happened between us, you believed you understood the whole story. "I did understand," I replied immediately. "You used me." The words came out colder than I intended, but I didn't regret them. For a brief moment, his expression changed. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. Still, it disappeared almost instantly. "You only saw the part of the story that affected you," he said. "There were other things happening at the time, things you never knew about. That doesn't change what you did." "No," he admitted, "it doesn't." The honesty surprised me enough that I stayed silent. Tristan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving around the restaurant for a moment before returning to me. "But the reason I'm here tonight isn't to argue about old decisions. It's because something connected to those decisions has come back." A quiet sense of unease settled in my chest. "What does that mean?" Before he answered, a waiter walked past our table carrying a tray of drinks. The brief interruption made the moment stretch longer, and I realized Tristan was choosing his next words very carefully. Finally, he spoke again. "Do you remember the company we were working with during our final year at college?" I frowned slightly. "You're going to have to be more specific." "Orion Systems." The name instantly pulled a memory from the back of my mind. A small tech startup that had been offering internships to students at the time. It had seemed like an incredible opportunity back then, the kind of place that promised rapid success to anyone talented enough to join. "Yes, I remember," I said slowly. "You got the internship. I didn't." "That's what you believed." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" Tristan leaned forward again, lowering his voice even further. "You were actually the first person they selected." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "That doesn't make any sense," I said. "I received a rejection email." "You did," he said calmly. A cold realization began forming in my mind. "You're saying someone changed it?" Tristan held my gaze. "I did." The words hit harder than I expected. For a second, I couldn't even respond, because suddenly dozens of old memories were rearranging themselves in my mind. The disappointment I had felt back then. The way Tristan had tried to comfort me afterward. The way he had encouraged me to apply for something else. "You stole it," I said quietly. "Yes. And you're telling me this now because..." "What? You want forgiveness?" Tristan shook his head. "No," he said. "Forgiveness would make things easier, and nothing about this situation is easy." My patience was starting to disappear. "Then explain it properly." For the first time since he arrived, the confident composure in his face began to crack slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that I could see something genuine behind it. "That internship turned into something much bigger than anyone expected," he said slowly. "Orion Systems didn't stay a startup for long. Within 3 years, they were handling security software for government contractors." I blinked, trying to process the information. And some of the data they were protecting recently disappeared. The sentence was calm, but the meaning behind it felt dangerous. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked. Tristan's answer came without hesitation. "Because the person who stole it believes you were involved." The world seemed to tilt slightly. "That's ridiculous," I said immediately. "I never even worked there." "I know that. Then why would anyone think I did?" Tristan's eyes darkened a little. "Because your name appears in the original internship records, the ones that existed before I changed them." My chest tightened, and whoever is investigating this situation recently found those records. A long silence followed. I could hear people laughing at a table somewhere behind me, completely unaware that my evening had just turned into something I didn't understand yet. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. "Tristan, who exactly is investigating this?" For the first time that night, he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the restaurant entrance again, his expression suddenly alert, like someone who had just noticed a problem arriving sooner than expected. When he looked back at me, his voice was lower than before. "That," he said quietly, "is something you're about to find out." For a moment, I thought Tristan was joking. The idea sounded too strange to be real. I slowly turned in my chair and looked toward the entrance of the restaurant, half expecting nothing unusual to be there. The door had just closed behind a couple who were laughing about something, completely unaware that the room had suddenly begun to feel much smaller to me. When I looked back at Tristan, his expression had changed. The relaxed confidence he carried earlier was gone. In its place was a quiet alertness that made my chest tighten, the kind of look people wear when they know trouble might walk through the door at any moment. "You're not being dramatic, are you?" I asked quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," he said. And the answer came too quickly to feel comfortable. I followed his gaze again and scanned the restaurant more carefully, this time paying attention to details I had ignored earlier. Near the entrance, a man stood beside the host counter pretending to check something on his phone. But every few seconds his eyes moved slowly across the room. "Do you know him?" I asked, still watching the stranger. Tristan shook his head slowly, his attention never leaving the entrance. "Not personally," he said, "but I recognize the type." "That's not very helpful," I replied, irritation creeping into my voice. He leaned slightly forward and lowered his voice again, careful that no one nearby could hear us. "When the data disappeared from Orion Systems, it didn't just upset the company," he explained. "The information was tied to several government contracts, and when something like that goes missing, private investigators start looking for answers very quickly." My stomach tightened a little, because I could already see where the explanation was heading. "And somehow they ended up looking at me," I said, more as a statement than a question. "Yes," Tristan replied simply, and the calmness in his voice made it worse. "But I never even worked there," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my tone. "That part won't matter if someone is looking for a convenient explanation," he said, his voice steady and quiet. I stared at him for a moment, trying to understand how my life had suddenly stepped into a situation I knew nothing about. "Why would they think I took anything?" I asked, the confusion growing stronger. What possible connection could they make? Tristan hesitated before answering, which immediately made me uneasy. "Because your name appears in the early access records," he said slowly. "Those records show that you were originally approved for the internship, which means technically you were one of the first people granted system credentials." "That was 5 years ago," I said, disbelief creeping into my voice. "True," he replied, "but investigators don't always begin with logic. Sometimes they start with a list of names, and then they follow anything that looks unusual." The explanation did nothing to calm me. If anything, it made the situation feel more real. Across the table, Maya had been listening carefully while pretending to scroll through her phone. But now she leaned closer. "Okay," she said quietly, her practical tone returning. "Let's assume this situation is real. What exactly are we supposed to do about it?" Tristan finally looked at her directly, studying her for a moment before answering. "Right now, nothing dramatic," he said. "The worst thing we could do is panic." "That's easy for you to say," Maya replied, folding her arms. You're not the one whose name just got dragged into some investigation." Tristan didn't argue. He simply nodded slightly. Instead, he turned his attention back to me, his expression calmer now. "I came here tonight because I wanted you to hear this from me, before someone else started asking questions," he said quietly. "If someone contacts you, at least you'll understand why." I considered his words carefully, because part of me still didn't understand his real motive. "Why warn me at all?" I asked finally. "You could have stayed quiet and avoided all of this." A faint, tired smile appeared on his face, the kind that suggested regret. "I caused the original problem," he admitted, his voice softer now. "The least I can do is give you a chance to prepare." The honesty in his voice surprised me again, and that made it harder to stay angry. For several seconds, the three of us sat in silence, while the restaurant continued its normal evening around us. Plates clinked softly, conversations flowed between tables, and quiet music played somewhere in the background, completely disconnected from the tension sitting at our table. Eventually, Maya broke the silence, because she had never been the patient type. "So what happens if that guy over there actually comes to this table?" she asked, nodding slightly toward the entrance. Tristan glanced in that direction again, his attention sharp. "Then we answer simple questions," he said calmly, like he had already rehearsed the situation in his mind. "And we keep the story straightforward." "What story?" Maya asked, raising an eyebrow. "The truth," he said, without hesitation. I wasn't completely convinced the truth would be enough, but for now it was the only option. A few minutes passed slowly, each second stretching longer than it should have. The man near the entrance eventually spoke with the host, nodded politely, and then walked back out into the street. The door closed behind him, and the tension at our table eased slightly. Maya exhaled slowly, relief visible on her face. "Maybe he wasn't looking for us at all," she said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe," Tristan replied, though he didn't sound fully convinced. I leaned back in my chair, trying to organize the thoughts moving through my head. "Let's assume investigators eventually contact me," I said, forcing myself to think logically. "What exactly do I tell them?" "The same thing you told me earlier," Tristan replied. "You applied for the internship, received a rejection email, and moved on with your life." "That's technically true," I admitted, "and technically verifiable," he added. I studied him carefully for a moment, because something about the conversation still felt unfinished. "You're leaving out something important," I said. "What?" "You changed the records," I reminded him, watching his reaction carefully. "If they dig deep enough, that part will appear eventually." Tristan didn't deny it. He simply nodded. "Yes," he said calmly, "and when that happens, I'll deal with it." The certainty in his voice surprised me again, because it didn't sound like someone trying to escape responsibility. "You'd actually admit it?" I asked, searching his expression. "If necessary," he said quietly. I wasn't sure whether to believe him, but for the first time in years, he sounded sincere. Dinner eventually ended without any further surprises, and Tristan paid the bill despite Maya's protests. A few minutes later, we stepped outside into the cool night air, leaving the warmth of the restaurant behind. The city streets were quieter now. Traffic had slowed, and most nearby shops were already closing. A soft wind moved along the sidewalk, carrying distant sounds of passing cars. For a moment, we simply stood there, none of us quite sure what to say next. "Where are you staying?" Maya asked Tristan, breaking the silence. "Hotel 2 blocks from here," he replied. "And tomorrow? I'll probably leave the city." The answer caught me off guard, because it sounded final. "You came all this way just to warn me, and then disappear again?" I asked. "That was the plan," he said simply. I crossed my arms, shaking my head slightly. "You always did like dramatic exits," I said. A small familiar smile appeared on his face, one I hadn't seen in years. "Old habits," he admitted. For a moment, neither of us spoke, 5 years of history hanging quietly between us. There were still questions I could ask, still frustrations I could express. But suddenly they didn't seem as important anymore. Finally, I sighed softly. Next time you decide to rewrite someone's life, I said, my tone calmer now, try asking first. That would have been smarter, he admitted. Maya looked between the two of us, clearly relieved the tension was fading. Well, she said lightly, this has officially been the strangest dinner I've had all year. That comment finally made me laugh, the sound breaking the heaviness of the evening. We walked together toward the corner of the street, the city lights reflecting softly on the pavement. When we reached the intersection, Tristan stopped. This is where I go, he said quietly. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the past and present meeting in a strange kind of silence. Take care of yourself, Elara, he added. You too, I replied. He nodded once, then turned and walked down the street without looking back. Maya and I watched until he disappeared around the corner, his figure fading into the night. Only then did she speak. Do you believe him? She asked. I thought about the question for a long moment, weighing everything that had happened tonight. I believe he thinks he's telling the truth, I said finally. That's not exactly comforting, she replied. No, I admitted quietly, but it might be enough.